Hey friends, the new Warhammer Commander pre-constructed deck, Necron Dynasties, has just been revealed, so it's time to take a deep dive at all the sweet new cards that are going to be featured in this deck. But before we begin, two quick reminders. First, if you like this sort of content, be sure to like and subscribe. There's one more Warhammer pre-constructed deck that's going to be revealed tomorrow, and I will have a video breakdown of that as soon as it's revealed as well, so be sure to come back to the channel tomorrow to check that out. And number two, if you want to pre-order these sweet new Warhammer decks, you can head on over to our sponsor, cardkingdom.com/mtggoldfish, and be sure to ask for a scoop sticker in the order notes. Alright, let's check out the deck starting with the face commander. This is Szarekh the Silent King. This is a mono black 4-mana 3/4 legendary artifact creature Necron with flying and My Will Be Done. Whenever it attacks, mill 3 cards, you may put an artifact creature card or vehicle card from among the cards milled this way into your hand. So this card basically tells you everything you need to know about the Necron Dynasties pre-constructed deck. It's mono black and it cares about artifact creatures and vehicles, specifically putting them in the graveyard, getting them back out of the graveyard, recasting them over and over, and grinding down your opponents. And that's what Szarekh does. It's a mill engine, and it's a recursion engine specifically for artifact creature cards and vehicle cards. Now, the deck itself, I believe, has 31 artifact creatures and vehicles, so 31 hits in a 99 card deck, so that's about a 76% hit rate. So Szarekh is a very consistent engine in the deck, but it's not very abusable. You can only do it once per turn, and it's not going to be something that's going to run away with the game or anything, but it's nice to have in the command zone, kind of enabling the rest of the deck. However, we have 5 commanders in total in this deck, 4 others in the 99, and the second one is Imotekh the Stormlord. This is a 4-mana 3/3 legendary artifact creature Necron with 2 abilities. First is Pharaon. Whenever one or more artifact cards leave your graveyard, create 2 2/2 black Necron warrior artifact creature tokens, and Grand Strategist. At the beginning of combat on your turn, another target artifact creature you control gets +2/+2 and gains menace until end of turn. I think this is probably going to be a more powerful commander outside of the pre-constructed deck. I think Szarekh makes a lot of sense as the commander of this pre-constructed deck if you're leaving it as a stock list, because you want to have some sort of self-mill engine that also acts as recursion, but this has more abusability outside of the deck, and it's specifically because of that first ability, the Pharaon ability, where it can make a lot of artifact creatures very easily if you have ways of recurring your artifact cards from your graveyard, which there are a lot of ways to do, but there's more infinite potential outside of the pre-constructed deck that you don't really have in here. So I'm going to touch upon some ways of abusing Imotekh outside of the precon. I know a lot of people are going to be buying this pre-constructed deck and keeping it a stock list, a stock Warhammer themed list, but this has a lot of value outside of the pre-constructed deck too. So I just wanted to quickly mention that there are combo potentials. For example, if you have 2 artifact creatures, one in your hand and one in your graveyard, if you pair that with Phyrexian Altar and Tortured Existence, you can make infinite mana and also make infinite creatures at the same time. So just throwing it out there, if you want to take Imotekh outside of the pre-constructed deck and build upon that, you can use that for a lot of combo engines. Moving on, we have another potential commander in the deck, Illuminor Szeras. This is a 3-mana 3/3 legendary artifact creature Necron with Secrets of the Soul. You can tap it and sacrifice another creature to add an amount of black equal to the sacrificed creature's mana value. Now this card is fantastic in an aristocrats or sacrifice style deck, not just in this pre-constructed deck where it is fantastic. It not only is a very interesting style of ramp, it's a sacrifice engine as well. It gets your artifact creatures into your graveyard so you can recur them and get all those synergy potentials going. So it's a fantastic engine in the pre-constructed deck, but I want to just compare it to other options we have outside of the deck as well. It's very comparable to basically Soldelvi Adnate, which I think is a criminally underrated card in Commander in general. It can also sacrifice black or artifact creatures, whereas Illuminor just sacrifices any creature, and it generates that much black mana, same as other. And I think it has a lot of potential outside of the pre-constructed pre-constructed deck as well. If you pair it with stuff like Kakusha, the Evening Star, you're generating 6 mana off this while getting the powerful death triggers. And if you're sacrificing a bunch of stuff, you're making a lot of mana. You can set up easily for like a Patriarch's Bidding effect, a massive recursion effect that costs a lot of mana with Illuminor very easily. So again, this card is fantastic in the pre-constructed deck. It makes a lot of sense. However, it has also a lot of potential outside of it as well. Moving on, we have Anrakyr the Traveller. This is a 5-mana 4/4 legendary artifact creature Necron with Lord of the Pyrean Legions. Whenever Anrakyr attacks, you may cast an artifact spell from your hand or graveyard by paying life equal to its mana value rather than paying its mana cost. So basically, Anrakyr is a fantastic recursion engine, but also a fantastic mana advantage engine. You're basically allowed to spend life to cast spells instead of paying mana, which is always going to be a very powerful and highly abusable thing to do in Magic the Gathering. So again, this is a fantastic card in the pre-constructed deck. This deck is all about casting artifact spells, and it's all about recurring artifacts from the graveyard. Anrakyr does both of that. It's a mana advantage engine, as I spoke before, because you can spend life instead of spending mana to cast those spells. But again, this has a ton of potential outside of the pre-constructed deck as well for people who are interested in that sort of stuff. And just very briefly, you can entomb whatever powerful artifact you want directly into the graveyard and immediately attack with Anrakyr and cast it for life instead. Very fantastic card, both in the pre-constructed deck, does exactly what the deck wants to be doing, but also has a ton of value outside of it as well. Moving on, we have Trazyn the Infinite. This is a 6-mana 4/6 legendary artifact creature Necron, Death Touch, and Prismatic Gallery. As long as it's on the battlefield, it has all activated abilities of all artifact cards in your graveyard. And for anybody who is just curious as to what Trazyn wants to be doing, it's the Wizard of the Coast basically says so in the name, the Infinite. You want to infinite combo with this card. In the pre-constructed deck, I don't think there are any infinites with Trazyn. Wizards of the Coast generally stays away from infinite combos in the pre-constructed decks, but definitely outside of the pre-constructed deck, there are a lot of combos. So inside this pre-constructed deck, obviously, this is, again, an artifact deck. There's a lot of artifact synergies going on, and you want to have a lot of artifacts in your graveyard for all these sort of synergies to pop off. And Trazyn basically wants to have artifacts in the graveyard so you can use its activated abilities in cool and interesting ways. However, again, this has a lot of potential outside of the pre-constructed deck as well that I would briefly want to touch up on, such as Gilded Lotus plus Staff of Domination. This is an infinite combo that allows you to make infinite mana and draw your entire deck in the process, and then from there you just win the game. So you have Gilded Lotus and Staff of Domination in your graveyard. You go infinite with Trazyn, which is very fitting. But again, I'm focusing mostly on the pre-constructed deck, so I won't delve too deeply on these other non-pre-con style of combos. So we covered the commander options in the deck. Now let's talk about some of the sweet cards in the 99 that aren't commanders. For example, we got Out of the Tombs. This is a 3-mana enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you put 2 Eon counters on Out of the Tombs, then mill cards equal to the number of Eon counters on it. If you withdraw a card while your library has no cards in it, instead return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. If you can't, you lose the game. So the Necron deck is all about artifact creatures, all about self-mill, and this enchantment does both of those things, right? It mills you every single turn, and once you are fully milled out, it starts reanimating all the creatures that you just milled and keeps you alive until, well, either the enchantment dies and you deck yourself, or you run out of creatures to reanimate and you die that way too. So this is a risky enchantment. In the context of this pre-constructed deck, it's a very solid mill engine. However, once you are out of cards in your library, you're basically one disenchant away from dying, or just one graveyard exile from dying too. So I don't know about this card in terms of using it fairly. However, again, There is one really cool thing I want to shout out of using this card outside of the pre-constructed deck, and that's the one other notable card that uses Eon counters. It's Magosi the Waterveil and Nesting Grounds. Using Out of the Tombs and Magosi the Waterveil and Nesting Grounds, you can actually take infinite turns by moving the Eon counters from Out of the Tombs onto Magosi, removing the Eon counter off Magosi off the land itself to take an extra turn, and repeating that over and over again every single turn for infinite turns. It's hilarious, and we finally broke Magosi. It took many years, but we finally broke Magosi. Really cool. All right, moving on. We got Lychguard. This is a 3-mana 2/3 artifact creature Necron with Guardian Protocols. You can pay 4 mana and sacrifice it to return all legendary creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. So again, in the context of this precon, it's an artifact creature. It returns stuff from your graveyard to your hand, and it sacrifices itself. And that basically check marks all the things this pre-constructed deck is all about. It's all about artifact creatures, it's all about sacrifice, it's all about self-mill, and it's all about recurring stuff from the graveyard. So it does those things. I would say, though, in general, this card is a little bit underwhelming because it doesn't return stuff to the battlefield. It only returns it back to your hand, and then you have to spend the mana to recast the cards that you got from the graveyard. And it's also limited only to legendary creatures. I believe there's like 5 or so in the entire deck, so it's not going to be recurring that many things. And again, it goes to your hand, not your graveyard. We got a very spicy enchantment here. This is Biotransference. This is a 4-mana enchantment that says creatures you control are artifacts in addition to their other types. The same is true for creature spells you control and creature cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. And whenever you cast an artifact spell, you lose 1 life and create a 2/2 black Necron warrior artifact creature token. So in the context of this pre-constructed deck, this is one of the best cards you could see early on in the game. Most of your creatures are artifacts already, so you're not going to get that much value out of the first part of this enchantment, but the second part of the enchantment is really good. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, you're losing 1 life and you're creating an artifact creature token. Those artifact creature tokens are going to be great sacrifice fodder, they're great block fodder, and eventually, once you've assembled enough of them, you can start swinging in for lethal. And there are Anthem effects in the deck too that will pump up your 2/2 creature tokens and make them a little bit more battle hardy as well. So this card is fantastic. Moving on though, we have Their Number is Legion. This is an X and quadruple black sorcery that says create X tapped 2/2 black Necron warrior artifact creature tokens, then you gain life equal to the number of artifacts you control. And then you exile Their Number is Legion. And you may cast this spell from your graveyard. So this is a great card that pairs up very nicely with the face commanders, the Silent King, because you can just naturally mill this card into your graveyard. And then late game, when you have all this mana available to you, you sink it all into the sorcery from your graveyard and create a ton of tokens to overwhelm the board. And also you gain a ton of life in the process as well. So this is just a fantastic card for specifically this pre-constructed deck. It's one of the finishers of the deck and can really turn games around. Next, we've got Cryptek. This is a 4-mana 3/3 artifact creature Necron Wizard. You can pay 2 and tap it to choose another target artifact creature you control. When that creature dies this turn, return to the battlefield tapped under your control. So we're seeing a lot of cards in this deck that focus on sacrificing creatures for value, and the Cryptek runs very well with these cards because you can just save the sacrifice fodder from staying in the graveyard permanently. You can take advantage of extra death triggers, extra enter the battlefield triggers, and it's also a fantastic way of protecting your creatures from targeted removal or even board wipes to some extent. You can always save at least one creature from permanent death with Cryptek. So this is a cool little utility card that is nice protection in the deck and also works very well with sacrifice effects. Next up, we've got a vehicle, Night Scythe. This is a 3-mana 3/1 artifact vehicle with flying and Invasion Beams. When it enters the battlefield, create a 2/2 black Necron Warrior artifact creature token and has crew 2. So it has a nice little enter the battlefield effect. It puts a Necron Warrior on the battlefield. That's extra sacrifice fodder for you, and also the token itself can crew the Night Scythe. It's not a particularly large vehicle, it's just a 3/1 flyer, so it can poke people in the air a little bit, apply a little bit of pressure, but it's more interesting if you can blink it to get more tokens out of it. It's good in the context of the pre-constructed deck. I probably wouldn't be that interested in it outside of the precon, but it is alright. It's interesting. I like it in the precon. Moving on though, we got Necron Overlord. This is a 4-mana 2/5 artifact creature Necron Noble with Relentless March. You can pay X, tap it, and tap X untap artifacts you control to have target opponent lose X life. So we've already covered a bunch of ways of making 2/2 Necron artifact creature tokens, and this is a great way of just turning all those creature tokens into a finisher with Necron Overlord. If the board is gummed up, you have a bunch of 2/2s, but you can't attack with them, well, Necron Overlord will allow you to just tap all of them and just dome people until they die. And it's a repeatable effect, so every single turn, you're gonna kill people pretty quickly with this effect. Moving on, we got Necron Monolith. This is a very expensive vehicle. It's a 7-mana, 7/7 artifact vehicle with flying, indestructible, and Eternity Gate. Whenever it attacks, mill 3 cards. For each creature card milled this way, create a 2/2 black Necron Warrior artifact creature token. So every single time it's attacking, it's a flying indestructible, so this is a lot of pressure in the air. Every single time you're attacking, you can make 0 to 3 2/2 Necron Warrior artifact creature tokens. That's a pretty decent rate, I think. 7 mana is a lot, though. Even in the context of the precon deck, you really want to have ways to cheat it out into play. And the deck does have some ways of, like, casting it from your graveyard by paying life instead of the mana. And that's a great way of getting the Monolith out onto the battlefield. And it is a late game, just a good beater. Like, it's indestructible as well, and it has flying. So it is a great way to just grind out your opponents in the late game. 7 mana is a lot, though. It is a lot. I like it in the context of the precon deck, but probably not outside of it. Next up, though, we have a card that I think is going to see a lot of play even outside of the pre-constructed deck. This is Necron Deathmark. It's a 5-mana, 3 and double black, 5/3 artifact creature Necron with Flash and Synaptic Disintegrator. When it enters the battlefield, destroy up to 1 target creature, and target player mills 3 cards. This card is gas. This is an enter the battlefield effect that destroys a creature, and it gets to mill 3 cards, probably just milling yourself so you can set up that recursion engine going for your deck. But it has flash, so you can do this at instant speed. This card is supreme gas. It's a great target to be blinked. It's a great target to be recurred with all your graveyard artifact recursion stuff. And it's going to take out the biggest threat at the table every single time. And it's a 5/3, so it can get in there for damage as well. I can see this being an amazing 2-for-1 as well. If you're, like, being attacked by a creature, you can flash it in, destroy something, then trade with the attacking creature as well. This card is really good. And just for comparison's sake, I know I don't want to bring up outside cards too often, but for comparison's sake, cards that I would be running fairly consistently in other decks in Commander. Noxious Gearhulk, 6-drop artifact creature that also has ETB, kill a creature. It gains life. And Duplicant is also 6 mana. It exiles a creature when ETBs. But Necron Deathmark costs 1 less, and it does it at flash speed, so you can just do it at instant speed, taking stuff out. I think Necron Deathmark is going to be way better than the Gearhulk and the Duplicant in most decks, and I'm going to be jamming it into a lot of decks in Commander just outside of the pre-constructed deck. So not only is this an all-star in the precon, but it's going to be an all-star in Commander in general, I think. There's a lot of amazing synergy potential and just being a good card in general in Commander. Next up, we got Lokhust Heavy Destroyer. This is 1 and triple black for a 3/2 artifact creature Necron with flying, and Imotekh Exterminator. When it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature, and it has Unearth 5 and triple black, so 8 mana to unearth it. So basically, this is a Fleshbag Marauder effect. for 4 mana instead of 3, and it's an artifact creature, and it's a Necron, and it flies, so it has artifact synergy potential, which makes it a little bit more interesting, paying 4 mana instead of 3, and it has Unearth, so if you do go into the late game and you need some just random creatures dead, then you can Unearth it for 8 mana, which is expensive, but it's fine as like an added bonus. So in comparison to a Fleshback Marauder, you're paying 1 extra, but it is an artifact creature, so it has artifact synergy, and it has that Unearth ability as well. I think it's worth it. I think this is a fantastic inclusion in this deck, and it's a fantastic inclusion in artifact decks in general. Next, we've got Hexmark Destroyer. This is a 6 mana, 6/6 artifact creature Necron with multi-threat Eliminator. It can't be blocked except by 6 or more creatures, and it has Unearth 6. So the Necron deck doesn't have a lot of big threats. A lot of the cards we've been looking at are like 2/2s, 3/3s, maybe 4/4s. They're definitely a lot on the smaller side compared to the Tyranid Swarm deck for sure that we saw earlier, which was huge beefy beaters, and even the Ruinous Powers, which was a mix of big heavy hitter demons that are like 6/6s and 5/5s, and some of the smaller creatures which were like 3/3s and some 4/4s which were like the Stardies, Traitor Legion type creatures. So this is notable for being a 6/6 in the pre-constructed deck, one of your heavier hitters. It has evasion as well. It's going to get around your opponent's blockers unless they can commit 6 or more creatures to blocking it. And it has Unearth, so late in the game, if you mill it, for example, you can bring it back and smack somebody for 6 pretty reliably. So in the context of the deck, it's going to be one of your late game haymakers, get some damage through, and it's really nice here. Next, though, we have Ghost Ark. This is a 4 mana, 3/3 artifact vehicle with flying at Repair Barge. Whenever it becomes crewed, each artifact creature card in your graveyard gains Unearth 3 until end of turn and has Crew 2. So this is a fantastic way mid to late game to just get that extra value out of all the creatures that are in your graveyard. You're going to be self-milling with this deck very consistently, so you're going to have a lot of creatures in your graveyard that way. Your creatures are naturally going to die over the course of combat and board wipes and all that stuff. So being able to unearth all your creatures for extra value over the late game is going to be a fantastic way to grind out your opponents. And that's kind of the deal with this pre-constructed deck. It doesn't have the biggest creatures, not the most impressive creatures compared to the Tyranid deck or the Ruinous Powers. However, they keep coming back. They keep coming back and they keep wearing down your opponents. And the Necron deck is very much trying to win over the late game, trying to just grind out your opponents slowly but surely. They keep dying, but they keep coming back. And so this is a great way to just grind down your opponents. Next, we have Flayed One. This is a 3 mana, 4/1 artifact creature Necron with lifelink and Flesh Flare. When it enters the battlefield, mill 3 cards. So again, this deck is all about artifact creatures and all about self-mill. This does both those two things, and a 4/1 with lifelink is a great blocker. It's a great even attacker if you really need to, but having this on the defensive, being able to trade with a 4 toughness creature or something like that is really nice, and it has lifelink, so it gains you some life too. So I see it primarily as a blocker, something that will delay potential attacks, and also it mills yourself, which is exactly what this deck wants to do. Next up, we have Cryptothrall, a 4 mana, 3/3 artifact creature construct with Protector. Other artifact creatures you control have hexproof. Now, this is actually a very solid rate for hexproof on your other artifact creatures. There are other cards in Magic the Gathering that give all your artifacts Shroud or hexproof, like Leonin Abunas, and I think there's a mono blue legendary that does it too. But this is an artifact, which is very notable, that gives your other artifact creatures hexproof, and that gives more inherent synergy to the deck here, and also artifact synergies in general outside of the deck as well. So this is a very solid rate for a solid card. Next, we've got Convergence of Dominion. This is a 3 mana artifact with Dynastic Command Node. As long as you control your commander, activated abilities of cards in your graveyard cost 2 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the mana in that ability's activation to less than 1 mana. And Translocation Protocols, 3 and tap it to mill 3 cards. So again, this deck is all about self-mill. Convergence does that, and it's all about casting your creatures from the graveyard. Convergence makes that cheaper. It's a slam dunk in this deck. Next, we've got Chronomancer. It's a 2-mana, 1/1 artifact creature Necron wizard with flying and atomic transmutation. You can pay 1, tap it, and sacrifice another artifact to draw a card. And it has Unearth for 3 mana. So this is another way of just getting extra value out of your artifacts. It doesn't have to be non-token artifacts. So this deck makes a lot of artifact tokens, 2/2 Necron warrior tokens. So you can sacrifice those to keep drawing cards and grind out your opponent slowly but surely through card advantage as well, which is very nice. Next, we've got Canoptek Wraith. This is a 3-mana, 2/1 artifact creature Wraith with Wraith form. It can't be blocked, and Transdimensional Scout. When it deals combat damage to a player, you may pay 3 and sacrifice it. If you do, search your library for up to 2 basic land cards with the same name as a land you control, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. So this is basically a weird Burnished Heart type effect. You can pay 6 mana essentially to put 2 lands onto the battlefield. It's particularly good in monocolor decks, and it gets a lot worse outside of monocolor decks because it can only get 2 basics with the same name as a land you control. Or if you don't need lands, then you're hitting people for 2 repeatedly with an unblockable. I don't think it's particularly good in either way, but the flexibility is nice. Like sometimes you just don't need to ramp. If you get this late game, then you just want to start hitting people for 2. But if you get this early on in the game, maybe you just want to sacrifice it for 3 and get some ramp out of it. It's not particularly exciting either way, and I wouldn't recommend it outside of this deck, but it is interesting that it does both. It has some nice flexibility. Next, we've got Canoptek Tomb Sentinel. This is a 4-mana, 4/3 artifact creature insect with vigilance and exile cannon. When it enters the battlefield from a graveyard, exile up to 1 target non-land permanent and has Unearth 7. So this is the type of card that you want to basically mill away and then unearth it for 7 mana to exile a non-land permanent, kind of like a Meteor Golem from your graveyard. Alternatively, you could just cast it for 4 mana. It's a 4/3. It will trade with something, hopefully, eventually, or you sacrifice it for value, and then you unearth it later for 7. So either way, you either self-mill it, or you just play it early, you sacrifice it for value, and you unearth it later on. It's a solid card. You always want to have interaction in your decks, and this has the flexibility of hitting any non-land permanent and exiling it. Next, we've got Canoptek Spyder. This is a 5-mana, 4/4 artifact creature spider with flying and Fabricator Claw Array. Whenever another non-token artifact creature or vehicle enters the battlefield under your control, you draw a card. So this is a nice incremental draw engine in the deck. It's an artifact creature itself, so there's a lot of synergies in the deck for that. And this deck is all about artifact creatures and vehicles, as we've talked about before. So it's going to be drawing a lot of cards over the course of a game, and it's a 4/4 flyer, so it's going to be hitting people in the air pretty consistently as well. Pretty good for 5 mana. Next, we've got Canoptek Scarab Swarm. This is a 4-mana, 1/1 artifact creature insect with flying and Feeder Mandibles. When it enters the battlefield, exile target player's graveyard. For each artifact or lane card exiled this way, create a 1/1 insect artifact creature token with flying. So this is 4 mana, flying, enter the battlefield, graveyard hate. That's going to make a bunch of tokens, hopefully, when you exile a graveyard. This is a pretty great rate. For 4 mana, enter the battlefield, graveyard hate is always important, and this is a very solid rate for it. And remember, these are going to be artifact creature tokens as well, so not only does it have a lot of synergy in an artifact deck, but also, if you got a Skull Clamp, these are 1/1s, you're going to be drawing even more cards off this, and the fact that it's blinkable, so you can keep exiling stuff and making more tokens off it, is really nice as well. Next, we've got a new land card, which I think the Ruinous Powers and Tyrannid Swarm did not have a new land, so this is kind of interesting. This is Tomb Fortress. It's a land that enters the battlefield tapped. It taps for black, and you can pay 5 mana, 2 and triple black, and tap it and exile the Tomb Fortress to mill 4 cards, then return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. Wow, this is actually a pretty sweet card. I was thinking it would be returning the creature card from your graveyard to your hand, and then I'd be like, that's pretty meh, whatever. But this puts it directly onto the battlefield. So if you have like a 7-drop something big in your graveyard, which this deck does have a lot of 7-drops and 6-drops, and it's all about self-mill, you're gonna have something pretty decent that you're gonna return to the battlefield with this effect. It's pretty solid. I'm not gonna lie. Like, this is a great late game card that's gonna find a big threat when you don't really need that many lands on the battlefield anymore. You have too much mana. You're gonna just sacrifice this Tomb Fortress and put something really huge onto the battlefield that can swing the tide of battle for you. It enters the battlefield tapped, so there is a downside to this, but keep in mind, this is a mono black deck. Most of your lands are gonna be swamped. Most of them are gonna be entering the battlefield untapped, so having like 1 or 2 tap lands in your entire mana base is not a big deal. It's not gonna hurt you in terms of tempo. You're just gonna play it whenever you don't need that land entering the battlefield untapped, really. So yeah, this card is gas. This is a fantastic way of just adding an extra threat late game in the deck, and I think this card is playable outside of the pre-constructed deck as well. Next, we've got Tomb Blade, which is a 6-mana, 5/4 artifact creature Necron with flying, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player loses life equal to the number of creatures they control unless they sacrifice a creature, and has Unearth 8. I think this card's pretty doo-doo. 6-mana, 5/4 flying is like whatever. And then when it deals combat damage to a player, they loses life equal to the number of creatures they control unless they sacrifice a creature. So, like, let's say the best case scenario, in theory, is like, if somebody has like 10 creatures on the battlefield, like they're a go wide token deck, you smack them and then they could lose 10 life, or they can just sacrifice a creature and then they don't lose any extra life at all. So they'll just sacrifice a creature if it's an inconvenience to them. I don't know. This card's not very good. It's a flying threat. It's an artifact creature. It makes sense. It has Unearth, so it works well with the theme. But I don't know. There's a lot more impressive cards in the deck, I would say. Maybe I'm missing something here, but I don't think this card's very good. Moving on, though. Ooh, this is a cool name. Their name is Death. This is a 6-mana, 3 and triple black sorcery. Destroy all non-artifact creatures. Oh my goodness, this might be one of the best cards in the entire deck. This deck, as we've went in exhaustive detail, is all about artifact creatures. So this is an asymmetrical board wipe that leaves all your creatures alone, leaves them untouched, and destroys all your opponent's creatures, essentially. Or at least all their non-artifact creatures, which is, in a non-artifact deck, pretty much all of them. For 6 mana, that's really good. This is like a fantastic board wipe. This is going to be fantastic in basically any artifact deck. Like, in the pre-constructed deck, this is one of the best cards in the deck because it's going to leave your stuff untouched. It's going to blow up all your opponent's creatures, set them really far behind without setting yourself behind at all. And outside of that, like, if you're in an artifact deck, if you're in like Armix or Keskit or whatever, Glissa or whatever, asymmetrical board wipes are really good. So yeah, artifact decks just got an asymmetrical board wipe in black in the pre-constructed deck. That's really good. Yeah, pick this up. Next, we've got The War in Heaven. This is a 6-mana, 3 triple black saga that has 3 chapters. The first chapter says you draw 3 cards and you lose 3 life. The second chapter is mill 3 cards. And finally, the third chapter is choose up to 3 target creature cards with total mana value 8 or less in your graveyard. Return each of them to the battlefield with a Necrodermis counter on it. They're artifacts in addition to other types. This card is okay. It does everything the deck wants to be doing, obviously. Card draw is always very good, so the first chapter is always going to be relevant. Milling yourself is exactly what the deck wants to be doing, and returning stuff from the graveyard is exactly what the deck wants to be doing. And if they're not artifacts already, you turn them into artifacts to promote even more synergies there. It does everything the deck wants to be doing, but it's just very slow at it. It's 6 mana, and it's highly telegraphed, and it takes 3 turns for you to get all the value out of it. It's not a bad card by any means, but it's not super impressive because it is very slow. Moving on, though, we got Technomancer. This is a 7-mana, 5/1 artifact creature Necron Wizard. When it enters the battlefield, mill 3 cards, then return any number of artifact creature cards with total mana 6 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now, compared to the saga we just looked at, which also milled 3 cards, which also reanimated mana value of 8 instead of 6 here, but this does it all at once, all when it enters the battlefield, and it has blink potential, and it's a artifact creature itself, so it has more inherent synergy potential in the deck. Yeah, this card is way better than the Saga. I mean, you don't get to draw cards or whatever, and it costs 1 more mana. But all that aside, it's an enter the battlefield trigger that does everything immediately. It's a 5/1 creature as well that you get to either deal some damage with or trade with something. Then you can recur it very easily from the graveyard, unlike the Saga, which is an enchantment. This is an artifact creature. This is perfect. Yeah, this card is gas. This card is really good. Next, we've got Skorpekh Lord? Skorpekh Lord? I don't know how to say that. It's a 3-mana, 3/2 artifact creature Necron Noble with Menace and Command Protocols. Other artifact creatures you control get +1/+0 and have Menace, and has Unearth 3. This card is desperately needed in this. We've seen so many ways of filling the board with artifact creature tokens, but they're all 2/2s. So you need to utilize them some sort of way to actually make them formidable threats in the game, other than glorified chump blockers, I guess. And this gives them all +1/+0 and Menace, so they can actually get in there for lethal damage. That's fantastic. And it has Unearth too, so if you self-mill it or if it dies early on in the game, if you can set up for a lethal board attack, you can just Unearth it whenever you need it, and you can get that damage. So this is a fantastic, much-needed finisher in the deck, and yeah, it's going to be a great way to close out games. Next, we've got Skorpekh Destroyer. This is a 4-mana, 4/2 artifact creature Necron with Death Touch and Hyperphase Threshers. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, the Destroyer gains first strike until end of turn. So this is just kind of like a nice attacking creature. It's a 4/2 with Death Touch, so most things don't want to block or trade with it. And then it randomly getting first strike and Death Touch when you cast an artifact, which, you know, this deck is going to basically do every single turn, means it's always going to be attacking with as a 4/2 Death Touch first strike, which means your opponents basically can only chump block it. So it's going to get in there for 4 damage pretty consistently. There are some ways you can flash in artifacts in this deck too, so if an opponent attacks you expecting to trade with the Destroyer, you can just straight up just kill the creature instead and not trade with it. So it's pretty good. It's not super flashy or anything, but it gets the job done. It's like a good grunt in the deck. Next, we've got a really cool looking card. Ooh, Shard of the Void Dragon. This is a 7-mana, 7/7 creature Catan, flying and Spear of the Void Dragon. Whenever it attacks, each opponent sacrifices a non-land permanent, ooh la la, and Matter Absorption. Whenever an artifact is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, or is put into exile from the battlefield, put 2 +1/+1 counters on Shard of the Void Dragon. Whew. Okay, so this is a very expensive card. It's 7 mana, and it's a 7/7, and unlike a lot of the Necrons we were looking at, which were artifact creatures, which are easily recurred in the deck, this one is not so easily recurred. I mean, there are ways to recur it in the pre-constructed deck, and obviously there's a lot of easy ways of recurring it outside of the pre-constructed deck if you're using stuff like Reanimate and Animate Dead. But the Catan itself is not an artifact creature, so I think in the pre-constructed deck, most often you're going to be hard casting it for 7, but I think it's worth it. Whenever it's attacking, your opponents are going to be sacrificing something important, unless, you know, they're a token deck, for example, then it's not going to be super effective. But outside of token decks, they're going to be sacrificing something pretty decent each time. But the Matter Absorption is what really makes it a very threatening creature. Whenever an artifact is put into the graveyard from the battlefield or put into the exile, like, this deck is all about sacrificing and unearthing artifacts for value. So the Shard of the Void Dragon is going to grow huge. And keep in mind, it has flying, so it's going to kill people really easily. Like, imagine pairing Shard of the Void Dragon with like a Pitiless Plunderer or Smothering Tithe or a Dockside Extortionist. Anything that can make a lot of treasure tokens very easily that you can then sacrifice, put a ton of counters on Shard of the Void Dragon, and then just one-shot people with your flyer. That seems super fun. This card is very sweet and very epic. Moving on, we have Shard of the Nightbringer. This is an 8-mana, 8/8 creature Catan with flying and drain life. When it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, target opponent loses half their life rounded up. You gain life equal to the life loss this way. So this is a great So yeah, unlike the artifact creatures in the deck that very much want to be milled and then recurred from the graveyard, these C'tans definitely want to be cast from your hand. They cost a ton of mana, but they're definitely worth it. The life drain effect here is fantastic in swinging around games, and then after that you're left with an 8/8 flyer, which is also just a huge threat that is going to take out people and is going to be very hard to attack into. So yeah, this is a fantastic finisher and a fantastic way to get back in the game if you were behind. Next, though, we have a fantastic new mana rock for monocolor decks. This is Sceptre of Eternal Glory. It's a 4-mana legendary artifact. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color, or you can tap it to add 3 mana of any one color. Activate only if you control 3 or more lands with the same name. So this is pretty much exclusively for monocolor decks. Tapping it to add 1 mana of any color is not good for a 4-mana mana rock, but tapping it to add 3 mana of any one color is basically a superior Thran Dynamo, because you're tapping it for for colored mana instead of just colorless. And having 3 or more lands with the same name is very easy to do in basically any monocolor deck. It's fairly easy to do also in 2-color decks if you actually believe in basic lands, which I know some of my co-hosts like Seth do not believe in basics even in monocolor decks, but trust me, it's pretty easy to do in monocolor decks and 2-color decks. And in those situations where you can have it as a Thran Dynamo that taps for actually colored mana, is actually pretty good. It's really solid. Moving on, though, we got Sautekh Immortal. This is a 3-mana 2/2 artifact creature Necron with Flash and Elite Troops. The Immortal enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each creature that died this turn. So I think the idea here is basically you wait for somebody to wipe the board, or you wipe the board yourself, then you pay 3 mana, you flash this into the battlefield, and boom, you have a huge creature. It's an artifact creature, so there's inherent synergy. But yeah, it's just a big creature. It doesn't have evasion or anything. It doesn't have recursion or anything. So it's okay, but it's not like particularly exciting or anything. Moving on, though, we got Royal Warden. This is a 5-mana 3/2 artifact creature Necron with Phalanx Commander. When it enters the battlefield, create 2 tapped 2/2 black Necron Warrior artifact creature tokens, and it has Unearth for 4. So for 5 mana, you're getting a 3/2, and then you're getting 2 additional 2/2 artifact creature tokens. So that's 7 power on the battlefield for 5 mana, and they're all artifact creatures, and having multiple creatures on the battlefield is super useful because we have a lot of ways to sacrifice artifacts for value and all that good stuff, and it has Unearth, so if it dies, or if you self-mill it, you can get it back one more time for even more value. This card's really good. It's everything this deck wants to be doing. It's really solid. Next, we've got Resurrection Orb. This is a 2-mana artifact equipment. Equipped creature has lifelink, and whenever equipped creature dies, return that card onto the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step, and it has equipped 4. So this is kind of like a Nim Deathmantle that is significantly worse because it has to be actually equipped on the creature, but it does give your thing lifelink, and it is, in the context of a pre-constructed deck, very solid because it gives that Necron army that resiliency, the inevitability of, you know, the board will be wiped and things will die, but the Necrons will keep coming back. It doesn't matter, and eventually they will win the game. So very flavorful, and it's a solid card. It's just, outside of the pre-constructed deck, I think it's overshadowed by slightly better options like the Nim Deathmantle. Next, we've got Psychomancer. It's a 2-mana 1/1 artifact creature Necron Wizard with flying and Harbinger of Despair. Whenever Psychomancer or another non-token artifact you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield or is put into exile from the battlefield, target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So this is basically like a Blood Artist effect for your non-token artifacts. That's good. I mean, it's a thematic Blood Artist, and this deck is all about sacrificing and unearthing things and killing things and having stuff die and recur over and over again. So this just adds more drain effects, more inevitability to your deck, and it's a 2-mana Blood Artist. That's an artifact. That's perfect. Next, we've got Plasmancer. It's a 4-mana 3/3 artifact creature Necron Wizard with flying and Dynastic Advisor. When it enters the battlefield, search your library for a basic swamp card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. I wish it went onto the battlefield. Oh my goodness, I wish the Plasmancer put the swamp onto the battlefield, but as it is, It's a 3/3 flyer for 4. It's a fine body. It's an artifact, so inherent synergies, yada yada. I just wish they pushed it a little bit to put it into the battlefield because that would be amazing. And then I would probably run it in my mono black decks outside of this pre-constructed deck. As is, though, it's fine in the precon, whatever. Next up, though, we got Triarch Stalker. It's a 5-mana 4/5 artifact creature Necron with targeting relay. At the beginning of combat on your turn, choose an opponent. Creatures attacking the last chosen player have menace. So not only does this help your team attack for lethal against an opponent, get across blockers, but it also helps your opponents to help team up with you to attack whatever the chosen player was. So this is a sneaky way of kind of redirecting your opponent's ire, your opponent's attackers, over to a mutual enemy of yours, which is actually fantastic. It's an indirect way of protecting your own life total because it's kind of dissuading your opponents from attacking you by making somebody else more vulnerable and a tastier target. And that will yield more attacks to them, which is kind of like indirect damage in a way. Very sneaky, very powerful. I think it's kind of overlooked on how powerful this type of card effect is, but trust me, it's very good. And it's a 5-mana 4/5 artifact creature by itself, so there's no slouch at all in combat itself. I like this card a lot. Next, we got Triarch Praetorian. It's a 2-mana 2/1 flyer with dynastic codes. When it enters the battlefield from a graveyard, you draw 2 cards and you lose 2 life. And guess what? It has Unearth 5. So early flying attacker, whatever, it will trade eventually in combat. 5 mana, draw 2, lose 2. Yeah, that's good. It's not a particularly large creature. It doesn't really do that much in terms of combat, but, you know, it's extra value in the graveyard, and it is an artifact creature, so extra synergy. Yahoo! And guess what, folks? That was the last card. So we got to the end of the brand new cards from the Necron Dynasty deck. I hope you liked my breakdown of this pre-constructed deck, and be sure to like and subscribe because tomorrow I will be covering the last pre-constructed deck, the Imperium deck, in full detail as soon as it is released, which is 5 p.m. Eastern time, and I'll probably have the video up like 3 hours after that or so. I try to get it out as quickly as possible. So if you like these breakdowns, like and subscribe, and be sure to come back tomorrow for that breakdown as well. And until next time, friends, see ya!